Hi everyone, welcome to our Friday seminar. I'm Lisa Pierce, faculty member in sociology and fellow here at CPC, and I'm fortunate to be able to introduce my colleague today. We have someone from CPC speaking to us. And this is Jessica Sue. She is an assistant professor in sociology and also a fellow here at CPC. She got her Ph.D. From Cornell and actually spent a few years at University of Buffalo as a professor there, and then we were fortunate to have her join us this year at UNC. And Jessica focuses her work on family and inequalities. She does a lot of work looking at the causes and consequences of unintended childbearing, and just is generally interested in the ways that either unintended childbearing or other kinds of family formation kinds of dynamics are related to parents and children's well-being. So I look forward to hearing what she's presenting today, and I'll let her go ahead.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you so much for introducing me, Lisa, and thank you all for attending today. I am very honored to have the opportunity to share my work with you. So today I'm going to be presenting some new work. It's a work in progress. It's part of my larger research agenda on the causes and consequences of unintended fertility. So today I'm specifically going to be looking at how wealth and assets are related to unintended childbearing.
You might just want to find
And there's another elevator.
Sorry. So welcome. So I believe this is a group of prospective graduate students for the sociology department. I'm especially honored to be able to present my research and to give you a sense of kind of work that I'm doing and the kind of work that others are doing here in the Department of Sociology and at the CPC more broadly. So as I mentioned, I am presenting today on the relationship between wealth, assets, and unintended childbearing. And this research that I'm going to be presenting, which is a work in progress, is co-authored with Senaba Otto, who we're actually very fortunate to also have in the audience today. Senaba is visiting Duke University this year, and she wins co-author of the year to be attending this talk. And if you have any particularly difficult questions, you can direct them to me. Okay. So in the United States, we have an exceptionally high rate of unintended childbearing. So about half of all pregnancies are considered unintended at the time of conception. And about 60% of those unintended pregnancies result in live birth. This is a very large amount, especially compared to other developed countries. So it presents a really interesting sociological puzzle. Why do we have such a high rate of unintended fertility here in the United States? This is concerning in part because there's a body of research that suggests that unintended childbearing is linked with a host of adverse outcomes for both parents and children. So there's literature linking unintended childbearing to poor physical health for infants and children, poor mental health for parents and children, some less effective parenting styles, some poor parent-child relationships. And importantly, I want to point out that the ability to control both the number of children and the timing of those children is linked to women's social and economic mobility. Importantly, there's also been some research that suggests that having an unintended child is linked with a higher likelihood of having subsequent unintended children. So this is a family formation pattern that's potentially self-reinforcing. So we're potentially concerned about this because unintended fertility is socially patterned. It is not equally distributed across the population. So some of these negative outcomes are concentrated among those who are already particularly marginalized. So as sociologists, we tend to focus on the classics, education, race and ethnicity, and income, and we see disparities according to all of those metrics. So here we can see that unintended fertility is much less common among women with a college degree. This is showing us that there are large racial and ethnic disparities in unintended childbearing. So here you can see that women of color are much more likely to have an unintended pregnancy, and Black women in particular are twice as likely as white women to have an unintended pregnancy. And here we're showing variation by income. So this is presenting income as a proportion of the federal poverty level. So those with less than 100% of the federal poverty level, that blue bar on the top, are the poorest women, and they are the most likely to have unintended pregnancy. And it proceeds on a continuum according to income level. Another thing I want to point out is that these past few charts I've been showing you are statistics for pregnancies, but women of color and lower income women are not only more likely to have an unintended pregnancy, but those pregnancies are also more likely to result in live birth compared to women who are in higher socioeconomic statuses or white women. So this is an important potential mechanism of inequality in our society. So although research has tended to focus on education and race and ethnicity and education in documenting these disparities of unintended pregnancy, the role of economic resources is still a little bit fuzzy. So in particular, although I just showed you that there were descriptive differences in unintended pregnancy based on income, once we control for other potentially confounding factors like marital status, age, education, in other studies, the effect of income actually becomes statistically insignificant. So that can lead us to a couple of different conclusions, right? So either the economic resources that we have aren't important for determining or shaping pregnancy intentions, or another possibility, which is what I will be arguing, is that income is not the best measure of economic resources, especially in thinking about fertility processes. So maybe we need to be thinking about this a little bit more broadly. So here I want to make a clear distinction between income and wealth as measures of economic resources. So income measures the flow of money into a household, but wealth measures a host of different dimensions of economic resources related to assets and liabilities. So assets can be your home, your car, or other financial vehicles such as savings and investment accounts. Liabilities can include your mortgage, a car loan, other unsecured debt like credit cards, personal loans, and education loans. And sometimes we consolidate these concepts of assets and liabilities by getting a measure of net wealth, which is just the total assets minus the total liabilities. And this gives us a slightly different vantage point on the economic resources in a household. So wealth not only measures economic resources, but it can also be an important indicator of the social and cultural resources that a family might have access to. And we can think about wealth as providing an economic safety net that might be what allows a family to move beyond paycheck to paycheck living or day-to-day survival. So this is a really important concept to get a broader picture of the economic resources in a household. So there's been growing interest in studying wealth inequality as opposed to income inequality over the past 20 years or so in sociology in particular. So this is in part driven by disproportionate growth in wealth at the top end of the income distribution, right? So we can all think about those 1%ers here. And it's also because of increasing attention to asset poverty. So when we think about asset poverty, this is a family that does not have enough resources to live at the federal poverty level for 3 months. And those resources can be measured in different ways. We can have net wealth asset poverty, or we can have asset poverty related to those more durable assets such as homes and mortgages. So based on this, about 20% of families in the US are considered to be asset poor. Another interesting characterization of this is that the Federal Reserve did a study that showed that about 52% of Americans would not be able to cover an emergency expense of $400 with their liquid savings. They would have to either sell something, borrow, or use a payday loan to cover that type of expense. So researchers are increasingly paying attention to disparities in wealth and assets. And there's a body of literature that suggests that wealth is linked to educational attainment, labor market outcomes, some aspects of family formation, and physical health. But what I would like to do is extend this conversation to be thinking about how it might be related to processes of fertility. So why would we care about wealth for family formation? So there's an influential body of qualitative research that has looked at non-marital childbearing among low-income women, and the research suggests that having or lacking financial security and lacking assets such as a home or a car might lead women to delay or forego marriage, but not delay their fertility. So this is part of an explanation for why we see such an increase in non-marital fertility in the United States. And quantitative research has actually supported this in showing that having a house, having a car is linked to the probability of marriage, but not to the probability of childbearing. However, these studies also note that there's quite a degree of variation in pregnancy intentions among these non-marital births. So some women will characterize their births as planned, some will say they're unplanned, and then there's also this ambivalence. Some say it's in between, or neither planned nor unplanned. And this raises a question for me, who thinks in this area, about, okay, if wealth isn't related to fertility overall, maybe it's related to whether or not a pregnancy or a birth is characterized as planned or unplanned. So that's the point of departure for this study. So why would wealth matter for pregnancy intentions in particular? I thought this was a very funny cartoon. If it says income, I would replace that with wealth. But this is actually illustrating the point that there may be a cultural significance to wealth. So in parallel with that qualitative literature about the significance of marriage, the significance of wealth for marriage, we might have a similar idea in that wealth is a symbolic marker of prestige that would qualify someone for intended childbearing. I also want to point out that it might help to shape a social stigma around pregnancy intentions. So for example, unintended childbearing is very stigmatized, particularly among women of higher socioeconomic status. But I also want to consider the flip of that, which is that intended childbearing may also be stigmatized if there are questions about whether or not someone can afford to raise a child and give them a good, stable life. So wealth and assets might be important for that symbolic significance and shaping that stigma. It's also possible that the material value of wealth is playing a role here. So this is the actual value of the assets that we're having. So first of all, raising children is very expensive. Any parent can tell you this. And having assets and wealth may provide a sense of security and stability that might cause people to feel more confident about characterizing their pregnancies as intended. Wealth also buffers against hardship, so you're more able to weather an economic shock such as a medical expense or an accident if you have sufficient wealth. And again, that may create a sense of security and stability that would make you more confident about having children. And then also the material value, we might think about having access, for example, to savings as a really important mechanism for accessing reproductive health care, in particular contraception or abortion. So there are a few different ways that wealth might be operating here, but there's not been really any quantitative research looking at how wealth might be related to these pregnancy intentions. Okay, so here's coming to our research questions. So first of all, we want to ask whether or not there's a relationship between net wealth and first birth. And this is in part to replicate some of what we're seeing in the qualitative literature, which is suggesting that having wealth isn't related to whether or not someone has a child. So here, we're extending this to a nationally representative population. We're not just limiting this to non-marital births among low-income women. Next, we want to know what happens if you then disaggregate those births by pregnancy intention and try to figure out whether they were intended or unintended. Do we see differential impacts based on that? And then we want to evaluate how specific assets are related to the pregnancy intention. And we want to distinguish between whether or not you own an asset and the value of those assets. So the previous literature gives us a few hypotheses that we can test here. So what we might expect is that higher net wealth will be associated with a higher likelihood of intended first births and a lower likelihood of unintended first births. Another hypothesis that we can derive is that if wealth is symbolically important, then the ownership of assets will be significant in this relationship. Whereas if wealth is more materially important, we might expect to see that the value of those assets will be significant. And in particular, the financial assets, such as savings accounts, might be really important because they're more liquid. So in embarking on these research questions, we're making several contributions to the existing literature. So first, we're extending literature on pregnancy intentions because the vast majority of research focuses on income as the only measure of economic resources, and we're bringing this conversation about wealth and assets to this dynamic of fertility. Second, we're extending the literature on wealth and family formation by thinking about how wealth might be related to fertility, and more particularly distinguishing between intended and unintended births. And then we're trying to shed light on the mechanism to, from a social perspective, try to understand how it might be operating. So just as we saw earlier that there's hypotheses that wealth might be operating in different ways for marriage and for childbearing, we might think that the mechanism would be different across those two different family formation patterns as well. So to answer these questions, we're drawing on data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth 1979 cohort. So this is a cohort of respondents who were 14 to 22 in 1979. And we limit our analytic sample to focus specifically on women, because women were the ones who reported about their pregnancies in this data set. We look at women at ages 20 to 48, which is roughly coinciding with their adult childbearing years. And this spans the time period of 1985 to 2006. So what we're doing here is we're excluding teen mothers, first of all, for a couple different reasons. So first of all, teens don't have assets or wealth independent of their parents. So we are wanting to disentangle the parental assets from the respondent's own assets. And also, teen childbearing is almost completely unintended. So it's a different beast altogether. And we think that the processes would probably be very different. So we're just going to focus on adult childbearing. We also exclude respondents who are missing data on their pregnancy intentions, and we exclude respondents if they're missing data on every single wealth measure that we're looking at. So this gives us a sample of about 2,400 unique respondents, and we structure the data such that they're contributing an observation for each wave in this longitudinal data set that they're observed. So this gives us about 14,805 person-year observations, but this varies according to the specific measure of wealth that we look at. Okay, so the dependent variable is a measure that looks at the conception of the first birth. So in the NLSY, we have the dates of birth, and then we can kind of back into an approximate date of conception. So at each wave, we know whether or not the respondent had not conceived their first birth, whether or not they had conceived their first birth and it was intended, and whether they had conceived their first birth and it was unintended. So pregnancy intentions are classified according to retrospective reports from the mothers. So pregnancies are classified as intended if the respondent had stopped using contraception because she wanted to become pregnant, or reported that it didn't matter when she got pregnant. So this is a little bit of that sense of ambivalence, but that's folded into the intended category here, in part because it's actually a very small sample size. Pregnancies are characterized as unintended if the respondent said that they wanted another baby, but not at that time, so the pregnancy came too soon, or if they didn't want another baby at all. Okay, so first of all, why are we limiting this to first births? Well, one of the things is that the transition to parenthood is a very stark turning point in the life course. And we think that this is conceptually a very clear way to start isolating the effect of wealth on fertility patterns. The next is this question of endogeneity. So wealth is endogenous to fertility. As we've already alluded to, having a child does not make you any richer. So once you have a child, your wealth and assets are probably going to decrease. The next question is, why are we focusing on births and not pregnancies? So for a couple reasons. So first, this allows us to consistently measure pregnancy intentions over time within the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. There is a brief period of time when they asked people to report all of the pregnancies that they had, whether or not they resulted in live births. But then starting in 1992, they only asked about live births. So we want a way to measure this consistently over time. And in addition, the reporting of pregnancies that do not result in live births is severely underreported. So people do not report their abortions, they do not report their miscarriages. So even if we have a sample of pregnancies, we're still effectively getting a sample of births because those other ones are missing from the reports. So there are clear limitations to this measure of pregnancy intentions in survey data. So first of all, there's retrospective reporting bias. And there's also social desirability bias. So if you're asking someone to look back at the time that they conceived their child, especially if it resulted in a live birth, they may be really reticent to say that that child was unplanned. As I already mentioned, this measure also doesn't do a great job of capturing ambivalence. And in fact, in some qualitative research, there is some suggestion that there's a lot of ambivalence going on here. And we're sort of boxing people in with this survey measure and categorizing them very clearly into categories for unintended and intended. And in fact, this is probably missing some important nuance in the way people are thinking about their pregnancies. And finally, the concept of planning a pregnancy may not be relevant for everyone. In particular, there are religious ideologies that do not emphasize self-efficacy in planning and spacing births. And there is, in some cases, this concept that it's not something that's within your control. So this is a measure with some clear downsides. Although I'm going to argue that there are also some clear upsides that still make it important to evaluate in empirical studies. So this measure that I'm using is the one that the government uses to track population health and also to benchmark goals for public health. So they use it in the Healthy People 2020. One of the goals is to reduce unintended fertility using this specific measure. There's also some evidence that retrospective reports don't bias estimates of the effect of unintended pregnancy. And this is based on some research that actually uses the NLSY79, which is the same data that I'm using in this study. We also see that in lots of research, these measures are still mapping on to outcomes for adults and children in the way that we would expect. So there's still some utility in looking at pregnancy intentions in this way. I also want to mention that it's important to look at pregnancy intentions because this is potentially tapping into a really important aspect of the childbearing context, particularly as marriage and childbearing are increasingly disconnected. So there used to be a really strong focus in the literature, or there still is a strong focus in the literature on looking at non-marital fertility, but there's an implicit assumption that most non-marital fertility is unintended. Now, that is not always clearly the case. In fact, I think it's around 40% of pregnancies to cohabiting couples are now planned. So we're seeing this increasing diversity in pathways to parenthood, and asking about intentions is going to tap into a different aspect of that context that just focusing on marital status doesn't allow us to see. Okay, so let's move on. So looking at the descriptive statistics for the data that we analyzed, this is the distribution of that dependent variable for conception of first birth. And we see that 67% of first-year observations had no conception, 27% had intended, and 6% had unintended. And this is actually aligned with national statistics. So remember in the beginning I said 50% of all pregnancies are unintended. The unit here is not pregnancies, it's people, and 5% of people have an unintended pregnancy each year.
And it's an unintended first pregnancy.
I'm sorry. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes, we're looking specifically at first pregnancy that generated the first birth.
Okay, and it's person year that you're looking at.
That's right. Okay. So the independent variables that we looked at, first we had a measure of net wealth, which is constructed by the NLSY and is drawing on a series of 20 questions asking really detailed information about the value of assets and liabilities. And then we break out very specific assets related to the home, the vehicle, and any financial assets that they have greater than $500. So the financial assets are lumping together a savings and checking account, CDs, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and retirement accounts. So all of these measures we lag to the year prior to conception in order to maintain the temporal ordering that we would need to establish a relationship between wealth and unintended childbearing as the outcome. We look at both dichotomous indicators of ownership, so either you have it or you don't, and then we also look at the value of the asset, which we adjust for inflation and report in terms of 2012 dollars. And then we log them to account for the skewness of the distribution. So here, so this is before I did all those transformations. This is just the mean value of net wealth in the prior year based on that independent variable of conception of the first birth. So here you can clearly see that those with an unintended conception have a much lower average level of net wealth compared to those with intended or no conception. Here's a distribution of the ownership of assets in the prior year. So you can see that those with intended conceptions are the ones who are the most likely to own each of these assets, to own a home, have a financial asset, or to own a car. We have a series of control variables, both time-invariant and time-varying. So for the time-invariant characteristics, we're controlling for race and ethnicity, a series of family characteristics for the respondent's own background at age 14, the religion at birth, and their cognitive test score. We also have a series of time-varying measures that we lag to the prior year. So we have relationship status, including an indicator for cohabitation. And then the usual suspects, we have age, education. I want to point out that we're also controlling for income. So our analysis nets out the effect of income from wealth. And then we have measures of family size, whether they're enrolled in school, a categorical measure of employment, whether they're employed full year full-time, full year part-time, or unemployed. whether they received welfare, and also we have an indicator for the year of the interview.
As a clarification point, sorry, what's family size if this is first birth? And where's marital status?
So relationship status is up here. So we have whether they're married, whether they're separated, divorced, widowed, and then we have an indicator for cohabitation saying whether or not there's someone in the roster. So family size can be the number of people in the household, so which is not always a nuclear family, right? So it's not just your own biological children who are always in your household. It may be stepchildren, there may be extended family members in the household, and we want to account for that in thinking about this relationship between wealth and fertility. Yeah, any questions or clarifications? I'm happy to, yeah.
It says receive welfare, but is there anything about insurance coverage status?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I don't have insurance status in there, but I will look up to see if that is available.
I think that would have a big impact on whether or not you plan on having a baby. It's expensive.
Yeah. And as we will talk about, it has implications for access to contraceptive care and abortion. But even if you have insurance as a low-income individual, if you're on Medicaid, you still don't have access to abortion because of the Hyde Amendment. So, but I take your point, right? So this is an important thing to think about. Okay, so to analyze the data, we're going to use discrete time event history models. So first we're going to look at some logistic regressions predicting just whether or not someone conceived a child. Then we're going to use multinomial logistic regression to disaggregate by the intention. We're going to first model net wealth, and we're going to do a supplementary analysis looking at stratifying by marital status and race and ethnicity. Then we're going to look at those asset indicators, in part to test that hypothesis that the symbolic value of wealth is important. We're going to look at asset values to see if it's material value of wealth that's important. Okay, so on to some results. So the first model is looking at this relationship between net wealth and first birth. And I'm showing this to you because I want to point out that we replicate the finding that net wealth is not related to whether or not you conceived your first child. So the coefficient is small, it's statistically insignificant, consistent with that story that wealth might be important for marriage, but maybe not necessarily for fertility. But then we disaggregate. We look at whether it's related to an intended conception or an unintended conception. And what we see here is that increases in net wealth are related to higher likelihoods of intended conceptions compared to being childless. And increases in net wealth are related to lower likelihood of unintended conception compared to childless. And also, the difference between those two coefficients is statistically significant, so they're different from each other. The reason I'm showing you this on this table, even though I know it's a cardinal rule that you don't show coefficients in a presentation, but I think it very nicely points out that we have countervailing effects here, right? So we have a positive coefficient on intended conception, and we have a negative coefficient on unintended conception. If we combine them together, they cancel each other out, leading us to assume that wealth is not important for fertility. So I plotted this out for you to make it a much nicer visual representation of the effect. So here we're looking at predicted probabilities of conception based on net wealth deciles. And you can see that the blue line is intended, the orange line is unintended, the blue line is going up. As you get more wealth, you're more likely to have an intended conception. The orange line is going down. As you get more wealth, you're less likely to have an unintended conception. So you might be asking yourself now, wait a minute, all of this is very tightly intertwined. So I think what you were getting at in your question was there are very clear interdependencies between marital status and wealth and fertility. So we wanted to look at what is going on. Let's stratify the sample by marital status and see if it's operating differently. Because remember, those other results that I just showed you are controlling for marital status, so we're kind of averaging out the effect, but it's not distinguishing between. So if we stratify by marital status, we see the effects for non-married on the left and married on the right. We see that among those who are not married, increases in net wealth are specifically related to those decreases in the likelihood of unintended conception. And for those who are married, it's positively related to predicting intended conception.
Where is cohabitating? Do you just drop them or do you include them in?
Yeah, so here I folded them into non-married, which you gave me the perfect segue for my next graph. So the reason I folded them in is a couple of reasons. So first of all, it's a smaller group. Second of all, the NLSY does not consistently measure cohabitation over time, which is very frustrating. So the way that I've measured it here is not the best. So I don't want to make too big of a deal of it, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
But the cohabitors here are in the green. We see that the relationship is steeper for them, although I also point out none of these differences are statistically significant here. So again, I don't want to make too big of a deal of it, but it does start to suggest that these dynamics are, different, maybe according to your relationship status.
Can I ask a quick clarification question? So for never married women, if they are living with a partner who owns the house and they're not on the house deed, is that considered an asset? Same with the car if they're never married?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that they ask in the NLSY is, do you or your spouse own?
For married folks.
Yes, well, for everyone.
Right.
Like, right. Is that correct? So this is, I think, a measure of a household asset. And this is also why we're interested in stratifying by married and non-married, because if you have someone else in the house, then clearly you're going to have some, there's an interrelationship here. So we also wanted to see whether or not this looks different by race and ethnicity. So actually I should take the opportunity to plug some of our other research. So we did also do a paper that looked at how disparities in net wealth contribute to racial and ethnic disparities in unintended childbearing, and we see that it is a significant driver. And here I want to point out that we think that this is operating differently by race and ethnicity. So we see the same effect from the main results among Latinas and whites, but we see that among Black women, there's no relationship here between net wealth and intended and unintended fertility. So again, I think this is illustrative. I don't want to put too fine a point on it because as we're stratifying the sample, we're getting into some small cell sizes. So I don't want to conclude that this is not an effect because it's not statistically significant. But I do think that it's important to start thinking through like how this might be acting differently, or we might see these different dynamics across different racial and ethnic groups. Okay. So next, we looked at specific assets. So remember, we have a model with just indicators of asset ownership, and then we have a model of the values of those assets. And what we see is that the ownership of the assets is not statistically related to intended or unintended pregnancy that results in first birth. But we do see that the value of a financial asset, such as a savings account or an investment account, is negatively related to the probability of an unintended pregnancy that results in first birth. So let me illustrate this for you. This is a predicted probability, and we're seeing that as the value of the financial asset increases, the less likely you are to have an unintended pregnancy, the more likely you are to have an intended pregnancy. Okay, so that's the main set of analyses that we have right now. We have some next steps that we're going to be looking into. First, we're going to look into measures of debt because we think that this is an important component of this net wealth equation. And we think that debt may be operating in some different ways. We have some preliminary results that suggest that having an other type of debt, such as a credit card debt, might be related with lower odds of having an intended pregnancy, but I'm not ready to present those results yet. But we think that that is going to be important because debt is related to family formation, such as marriage and cohabitation. Again, might be also related to fertility. There's some evidence that student loans is related to fertility, and we would like to join that conversation. We also would like to do a robustness check using pregnancies rather than births as the unit of analysis. But again, as I mentioned before, we have a finite observation window because of the way the data were collected in NLSY. But I think it would be a nice way to interrogate this relationship a little bit more closely. Some limitations to what we've done so far. Wealth and assets were reported for the respondent and partner combined. So this is related to George's question, but not measured separately for men here. And I think it would be really interesting to have that information, particularly as there's a body of literature that suggests that men's employment and financial contributions to the household are really important for things like marriage. And I also want to mention again that the survey measures that we have of pregnancy intention don't capture ambivalence. Nevertheless, I think it's pretty significant that we're seeing a clear and statistically significant relationship with this measure that we have. Okay, so let me revisit the hypotheses that we had set out at the beginning. The first hypothesis, that higher net wealth is associated with higher likelihood of intended birth and lower likelihood of unintended birth, has support. We did not see evidence of the symbolic importance of wealth, but we did see importance of the material value of wealth, particularly for savings accounts and financial assets. So let's just sum up the key takeaways here. So first of all, we've established that wealth is linked to a distinct dimension of fertility, and that is pregnancy intentions. And we're highlighting the fact that combining intended and unintended births may lead to some incorrect assumptions about the role of wealth in patterns of fertility. So what we were able to do was show some evidence consistent with conventional wisdom in the field, but then show that that's obscuring some of these more dynamic processes. We also have evidence that although wealth has symbolic value for marriage, for fertility, liquid financial assets might be more relevant. So a couple of points that I want to make to contextualize this finding. So I think it's particularly noteworthy because the measure of financial asset that we have in the NLSY is asking respondents to report for anything that they have of value above $500. Earlier in the presentation, I showed you that about half of Americans cannot absorb an unexpected expense of $400. And I think that this is relevant for thinking about unintended pregnancy, in part because of access to reproductive health care. So remember that we're talking about pregnancies that resulted in live births. And abortion is particularly expensive, and many women have to pay out of pocket. As we've already mentioned, low-income women in particular who are covered by Medicaid almost always have to pay out of pocket. And the average cost of an abortion is about $480. So we see a convergence here in terms of the assets, the amount of expenses that Americans are able to absorb, and the barriers to family planning that might be at play here. So another key takeaway is that we're establishing that economic resources are a barrier to family planning, and it potentially is going to lead to family formation patterns that compound disadvantage. So those are my main points. Thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions that you might have.
So I really enjoyed hearing about the work, and it makes me wonder about other kinds of unintended fertility. So there are two times that we tend to think about it: at the beginning of family formation, where people maybe get started before they intended, but it's also at the other end of the reproductive life, where people end up having a few extras, perhaps. And so my question to you is, do you think, and I understand the endogeneity issues, set them aside. I'm not asking, can you estimate this?
Right.
I'm asking you, what would you expect the effective wealth to be at the other end of the reproductive life cycle? I'd just be curious to know your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And we do tend to distinguish between pregnancies that are mistimed, meaning they came sooner than they wanted, and unwanted, which means that someone didn't want another pregnancy at all. And because of the way we ask these questions, it tends to track exactly onto what you're talking about, which is you have pregnancies that come too soon, but then you have pregnancies to women who have achieved their desired family size. They don't want to have anymore. So we think sometimes about the third child as, the extra bonus child that maybe was
The one that's 10 years younger than the other two.
Yeah. So that is me in my family. Full disclosure. And I do think that, it's probably, if I had to speculate, would be exacerbated for the end of the childbearing cycle, because you already have additional expenses for your other children. It's likely a much stronger economic shock. So if it is coming 10 years later and you weren't planning on having additional children, and if it's adding to the total family size, instead of just changing the timing of those children, then you're adding to the expense overall. So I think that the other thing we're distinguishing between the quantum and the tempo of childbearing here. And if we're increasing the family size, then the wealth is probably going to be more important. And in addition, maybe thinking about something like homeownership or car ownership. So this might also be when you need to get a bigger house or you need to get a bigger car because all of a sudden you have a family that's much larger than you thought. So maybe it's also related to this.
So do you think that greater wealth then would lead to an increase in the likelihood of those extra births? Or how would the wealth affect you?
I think that, having an unintended, or in this case, we would define it as unwanted birth, would create extra financial burden. So how would that operate for whether or not you characterize it as intended or unintended? I mean, I think that having lower wealth would make it more likely that you would characterize those third children as unintended. I'm speculating.
Kind of on going off that, would wealth impact access to insurance for things like sterilization procedures, which I know may be quite difficult to get, and that may, be something that impacts who has that unwanted child.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really important point. So you might have noticed when I showed rates of unintended pregnancy over time that there was a big dip between 2008 and 2011. And that is primarily attributed to both increased use of contraceptive, but also the proliferation of long-acting contraceptives that are very effective, such as IUDs. And I also want to point out that decrease in unintended pregnancy is actually a very key driver to the decrease in abortion that we've seen over that same period of time. So access to these types of reproductive contraceptives are a really key piece of the puzzle.
Do you know anything about sort of social networks and family resources and things like that? And I guess I'm thinking that there might be interactions. So the importance of wealth might go up if you have not many other resources to call on in terms of pregnancy.
Yeah. So I think that this is especially important in thinking about whether or not you have, for example, your mother living with you.
Or
So,
sisters.
Yeah. So I have a measure of whether or not you have your parent living in the household.
But you don't necessarily know proximity other than presence.
I don't know proximity, or I think what you're asking is really important, because the ability to weather a shock, like, you know, an economic shock, like a pregnancy, and maybe an emotional shock too, is probably moderated, by having that safety net, or, you know, the social safety net, the instrumental support that you could rely on. One thing I really would like to look at is how unintended childbearing affects the well-being of grandmothers, in part because I do think that there is a lot of reliance on extended family members when you have an unexpected pregnancy.
Related to that, I couldn't remember the measures you had up there, but do you have data, on the parents of the animal? So do you have measuring for the wealth, like the intergeneration, like the wealth of the parents? Just wonder how connected that is to the wealth of the.
So we have indicators of socioeconomic status related to the mother's education, whether or not those biological parents were living together, and whether or not there was an absence of literacy materials. But we do not have this direct measure of wealth, and I think that that's really important. Although I wondered if you would want to adjust for that, because it seems like part of the process of reproducing inequality.
Right. I mean, I was thinking of it as affecting the wealth of the child, as well as the probability of having an unintended versus an intended.
Yeah.
But those controls help.
They help. But I mean, I think the nice thing about measuring wealth instead of income is that it does help to capture these like legacies of disadvantage.
Right. I mean, it's not, if you're in a family, you know that your parents have wealth, and that, you know, the decision making around unintendedness might differ, I guess, is you wouldn't worry as much.
Yeah. I saw a paper that looked at parents' financial investments in their kids, and they didn't measure it as well, but it was the same idea in how that affected transition to birth. And it was using example, I think, from Denmark, but it was getting at this exact idea, and they found that, yes, like if your parents have assets and a strong financial support, then you're more likely to have children than if you don't have that familial support. I can't remember specifically what it was, but that's the idea that you're talking
I just wonder how you get around this endogeneity, because wealth is a cumulative process.
Right.
And you have an age continue going. And basically, if this everything being equal, the richer people will be selecting to have an intended pregnancy early on. And how this sample selection, you know, I could not get my head around. How does that affect basically the age patterns of childbearing? And you know, following Elizabeth's comment about on the shock is, I say, could you leverage the economic crisis in this 20-30 year period? Okay, there was sudden, stock market bust and your wealth, family wealth went off. Does that affect both the fertility itself or the intended itself?
Yes, those are great questions. So you're right. This is such a sticky issue because wealth accumulates over the life course, is like collinear with age and education, and then like you were saying, like this fertility issue. So I mean, we attempt to disentangle it with our year of interview, with the age of the person, but I think this is an issue that plagues research on wealth, not unique to this particular study. There was a review article by Fabian Becker and Sasha Kilowall that dealt with this exact issue, and I don't know that I have a very satisfactory answer for you, because I think you're right. If I come up with a way to figure this out, then maybe I will, that will bode well for my career.
Do we have enough time?
Yeah. No, that's not a strategy.
How did you set up your survival analysis? What is the duration? And is it age or some kind of cohabitation duration? Did you see, if you if you set up by some kind of marital cohabitation duration, did you see any marital duration effect? You know, how long, what's the length of marriage?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I did not explicitly adjust for marital
So
duration.
you just use age as the time, the duration
So
factor?
it's a year, like each year we're observing you, and because it's a cohort sample, like, they're aging similarly each year.
You know, alternatively, you can look at the marital duration, like the starting mortality, the birth would be the start of the clock. So the start of the clock would be the two persons living together, and potentially, so that's one possibility.
Right, yeah, so that's an interesting way to think about it. Although, so here we weren't as concerned with time to birth as we were thinking about.
The substantive question would be if the length of time the two persons living together is a factor for their fertility.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. I think it's also relevant to the literature that we know that if we start the clock based on when people live together, we get a closer look at the dynamics of the relationship. We see that relationship satisfaction tracks on to what you're talking about. And I imagine that it would also be related to the independence of fertility. But I have not looked at marital duration here or relationship duration. I think the tricky part of that here too is that we have people who aren't in relationships. We have people cycling in and out. So that is something we'll have to think more carefully about. But it's an excellent point.
This is like not my field, so sorry if this question is like a little bit macro, but I'm just curious. It's sort of, you kind of implied that like you were talked a lot about like the timing of births or different having kids. I'm wondering how about people that don't want to have kids at all, especially because now there are more like millennial generations are having more people not wanting any childbearing. So I'm just wondering about like the future of this work in that context.
So you're in the right room because Anna Rybinska is here and she does work on challenges, right? And she could probably speak better to this than I could. But yeah, I think that this is an important dimension of fertility intentions that I don't explore here and is probably increasingly important as norms about family formation have shifted.
I mean, even like family formation, right? Like if you're not intending to have childbearing, maybe your family formation is when you get married, or maybe your family formation, do you know what I'm saying? Like, because family formation might not be defined by birth is what I'm
kind of going on to that. I would think, do you have anything on like abortion values or like whether you support or not? Because I would think there would probably be a lot higher rate of unintended, especially among like minorities or religious groups. People just getting abortions immediately or like not having an unintended birth because they didn't get an abortion per se.
Yeah, so we have religiosity in here.
Well, it just says religion at birth, so let's be sure.
Oh yeah, so there is a question about fertility intentions as like, what is your ideal family size? Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. So they do track that, and that could be something that we could look into.
I wonder, in terms of the results for the Blacks that didn't turn out to consistent, I'm wondering whether you've thought about this issue of measuring intentions among Blacks. Is actually the way we measure it may not be meaningful in that population. I wonder whether you've looked at some of that literature around that.
Yeah, so it's possible that we don't see an effect because there's a lot more ambivalence and this measure is less valid for a particular population. But yeah, so also we're looking at like a little bit of sparse data here. So Blacks are much lower in net wealth, much lower in terms of marriage, much higher in terms of unintended childbearing. So it's harder to identify on this population.
So I mean, it seems like that's where worry about debt starts to maybe be really important, and even doing like some of this line with a not at zero. Really, if some people with actually negative wealth value, if they really were in debt, there may be sort of a real change there.
Yeah.
Looking for non-linearities.
Right, yeah, and I think that's kind of, as we
Yeah, it
work
seems
on
like
this,
your
this is
next
like our
agenda,
next step.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
because we're thinking about like, all right, so now we're focusing on the positive side of this, and we're seeing some interesting effects by race and ethnicity. But if we look at the negative side of it, maybe we're going to get some additional purchase on this.
Yeah, exactly.
One more, go ahead. Okay.
What about potential like social class differences and even how it gets reported? I mean, we're treating this as if it's a clear variable, but in fact, this is retrospective, right? So
it's retrospective, and you're absolutely right. So there may be greater stigma on unintended childbearing, particularly among those at higher socioeconomic statuses. And I am very careful in talking about this that we're reporting whether someone characterized their pregnancy or birth under these different classifications, because I want to be clear that this is reflecting a social process that's multi-layered, right? So we have this social desirability in reporting. We have this step in the process. We're moving from pregnancies to births, and we have a lot of underreporting of pregnancies that don't result in live births. And this is part of the social dynamic of fertility intentions. So I don't want to oversell what we're doing. But likewise, so one of the things that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation was just as there is stigma of unintended childbearing for those at higher levels of the socioeconomic distribution, I think there might also be stigma against intended childbearing among people who maybe are unable to provide a standard of living or financial security for kids that we might expect. So it might be really difficult to say, oh yes, I planned this child, even though I have very little to offer the child, or people may have questions about whether or not I can afford this child. So it's something that I take very seriously, and I think that, yeah, it's correct to be folding that into our understanding and interpretation of these findings.
We're at the end of our time, so please join me in thanking